Right, so let's pick up on that story, the very latest news from Sudan, and I'm joined by our correspondent there, Naba Mohiedeen. Naba, good evening. Thank you so much for coming through to us. So we know that there was a patchy ceasefire in place to try and open up a humanitarian corridor. Talk to us about how successful that was.
Yes, the ceasefire was just held after the two sides, the two warring factions, accused each other of violating the last ceasefire, which lasted for 1 week, and it was sponsored by Saudi Arabia and the United States, and it was expired on Monday. After that deadline, the two sides renewed fighting in the capital Khartoum, in the three main cities that make the greater capital, which is linked with the Nile confluence, Durman, Bahri and Khartoum. So there is fighting is still going on in the streets of the capital and in the main cities of the capital Khartoum. After that, there was an agreement to extend that ceasefire, but unfortunately it fell apart as the two sides escalated the fighting, and the military held the ceasefire talks in Jeddah, as they are accusing the RSF of violating the terms of the agreement signed earlier this month, and they are accusing them of occupation of hospitals and civilian buildings. So on the ground, the suspension of the ceasefire talks is heavily impacting the situation, and already the humanitarian corridors are unsafe for aid workers and organizations. There is a lot of donation by many countries and by organizations, but unfortunately it cannot be delivered under these circumstances.
Talk to us then about the humanitarian situation, because there were a lot of hopes pinned on this ceasefire, opening up help for civilians stuck behind the fighting, and then perhaps hopefully leading to more peace generally. It seems it's just not going to go in that direction now.
Actually, the humanitarian situation is really dire in the capital Khartoum. People are still stranded and they are still suffering a deteriorating health system and humanitarian catastrophe. There is lack of food, medicine and life-saving necessities, and most of the hospitals right now are not operating because it was targeted by the fighting in the capital. So the humanitarian situation is really dire. People are starving. People are dying of starvation and lack of medicine, especially elderly people and infants. So the situation is really bad, and a lot of people cannot even get out of the capital Khartoum for their own purposes. Some of them, they live very far from the traveling road, which is not possible for them to move around because of the continued heavy fighting. Also, the humanitarian situation in the camps outside Khartoum for 1.4 million people who fled the war zone in the capital is really dire and really deteriorating every day, especially in Al Jazeera state where I'm staying right now. Camps are empty, there is no food, there is no medicine, people are suffering starvation, and there is looming hunger crisis as the agricultural season is under threat of being impacted by the conflict in Khartoum. So the situation is really bad, and with the continued fighting and the ceasefire falling apart all over again, we are expecting a worse situation in the capital Khartoum and also in Western Darfur, where heavy fighting is impacting millions of or hundreds of thousands of people in Western Darfur and millions inside the capital. So unless there is a comprehensive peaceful solution for the crisis, unless there is peace talks and negotiations to stop the fighting forever, permanent ceasefire, we will not see any improvement on the ground for the humanitarian health or security situation.
This sounds absolutely horrific. As you say, millions of people are going to either starve or get caught up in this horrific conflict. Is there anything afoot now to try and effect peace talks or another ceasefire? What is the international community doing? Is there a next move in play already?
actually with the escalation by the military, by suspending the ceasefire talks, it's really very hard to predict what's next, because the two sides just chose to escalate, and on the ground there is escalation, there is fighting, there is a stop of delivery of aid, there is a deteriorating situation in all aspects. So unless there is huge pressure by the international community on the two rivals to stop this chaotic war and this chaotic conflict in the capital, and to restore at least basic services in the first phase, like water and electricity and of course telecommunications, we will not see any improvement on the ground. So there is some solutions like more pressure on the two rivals, and already US and other countries threatened the two military generals, military and paramilitary generals, to impose sanctions on Sudan, impose sanctions on them. So unless there is pressures like that on Sudan, on the two generals, we will not see any signs of a soon relief, because the two sides just chose to escalate, and the two sides are accusing each other of the violation of ceasefire. So there is no chance of peaceful solution unless the international community find another ways for diplomatic efforts, or by threatening them with more sanctions if the fighting continues in the capital or in other states in Sudan.
Oh, it sounds really very dire indeed. Thank you so much for the update. It's important that we stay abreast of this issue, because it looks like it's in danger of spiraling very deeply out of control. That's our correspondent in Sudan, Naba Mohiedeen.